In the summer of 1988, Harlan County, Kentucky recorded its driest June since the federal government began keeping weather records in 1901. 87 days without meaningful rain. The creek beds cracked open like old pottery. The corn, which should have stood knee-high by the 4th of July, barely reached a man's shin before it curled at the edges and gave up. 11 farms in the county filed for emergency drought assistance that year. 3 of them never came back. The Hollis family sold their eastern pasture to a soybean operation out of Lexington. The Cottles walked away from 140 acres their great-grandfather had cleared by hand. An older O'Meacham, who had farmed the bottom land along Sycamore Branch for 42 years, sat down on the tailgate of his Ford pickup one August morning and wept like a child because there was nothing left to water and nowhere left to turn. Nobody remembered all of that the way Clem Poole remembered it. Clem was 14 years old that summer, skinny as a fence post, with hands already too big for his arms and a quietness about him that made adults uncomfortable. He had been following his grandfather around those fields since he was old enough to walk, and he understood, even then, that what he was watching was not just a drought. It was a failure of memory. The land had always been dry in summer. The old-timers knew that. But somewhere between the Second World War and the age of irrigation catalogs and federal crop insurance, the farmers of Harlan County had stopped preparing for what they already knew was coming. They had traded patience for convenience, and the summer of 1988 was collecting on that debt. Clem's grandfather, a man named Roscoe Poole who smelled of pipe tobacco and creek mud, said very little about it. He just walked his fields in the evenings with his hands behind his back, stopping sometimes to pick up a handful of dirt and let it run through his fingers, watching where it fell, watching how it fell, like a doctor reading a patient's pulse. "You see that hollow over there," Roscoe said one evening, pointing to a low depression at the western edge of the property, where a scrub of willow and river birch grew thick and unruly among the rocks. "That hollow has never gone dry. Not once in my life. Not once in my daddy's life. The water finds its way there. Always has." Clem looked at the hollow. It was not much to look at. Weedy, mosquito-thick, tangled with wild grape and blackberry cane. The kind of place you pushed through on the way somewhere else. "Why?" Clem asked. Roscoe was quiet for a long time. "Because the land remembers where it wants to put its water," he said. "We just keep forgetting to listen." Roscoe died in the winter of 1994, leaving the farm to Clem's father, who left it to Clem 12 years after that when a heart attack took him at 61, young enough that people in town still shook their heads about it. By then Clem was 32 years old, unmarried, working the farm alone with a 1979 John Deere 4240 that burned a little oil and needed coaxing on cold mornings, and 214 acres of bottomland and hillside that had been in the Poole family since before the Civil War. He knew every acre of it the way most men know their own faces. He knew which fields drained slow after a hard rain and which ones went brittle by mid-July. He knew where the clay ran deep and where it gave way to sandy loam. He knew that the big field on the south end produced better when you planted it late, and that the north hillside was better left in hay because the topsoil was too thin and would blow away if you worked it too hard. He also knew about the hollow. In the spring of 2009, Clem Poole began digging. He did not announce it. He did not apply for a grant or take out a loan or bring in an engineer with a level and a clipboard. He rented a used excavator from a yard in Barberville and he started moving earth in that scrubby western hollow, following the contour of the land the way his grandfather had taught him to read it. He worked alone most days, coming in at dusk with red mud on his boots and his face, eating supper standing at the kitchen counter, going to bed early, rising before light. His neighbor, Dale Fugate, noticed the activity from across the fence line and drove his truck over one afternoon to take a look. Dale was 64 years old, big through the shoulders, with a white mustache and the habit of talking with his hands. He had farmed the adjacent 400 acres for most of his adult life and he considered himself a reasonable judge of what made sense on a piece of ground and what did not. He stood at the edge of the hollow for a while, watching Clem run the excavator bucket along the depression in slow, deliberate passes. "What in the world are you doing down in there, Clem?" Clem shut off the machine and climbed down. "Building a pond," he said. Dale looked around the hollow. He looked at the scrub trees and the rocky soil and the slope of the surrounding ground. He rubbed the back of his neck. "A pond," Dale said. Yes, sir. Down in here. Down in here. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Boy, there ain't enough watershed draining into this spot to fill a bathtub. You're going to dig yourself a big mud hole, and that's about all you're going to get." Clem nodded like he had considered that possibility and moved on from it. "We'll see," he said. Dale shook his head on the way back to his truck. He told his wife about it that evening at supper, and she told her sister at the beauty shop in town on Thursday, and by the following week it had made its way around enough kitchen tables and feed store counters that people were calling it Clem Poole's Folly without much embarrassment about saying it to his face. It was not the first time people had underestimated Clem Poole, and he had long since stopped letting it change what he did. He had always been the quiet one. In school he had not been the kind of boy teachers singled out for praise or principals worried about. He sat in the back, watched, absorbed. He read things that were not assigned. He checked out library books about hydrology and soil science and the history of water management in the American South. His senior year he wrote a paper on the Tennessee Valley Authority that his English teacher said was the most interesting thing she had read in 20 years of teaching, though she gave him a B- because his comma usage was inconsistent. He did not go to college. His father needed him on the farm and there was no money for it anyway, and he had, by then, already decided that the education he needed was mostly under his feet. The digging took 3 weeks. When the excavator went back to the rental yard, what Clem had left behind looked, to most observers, like a large and optimistic wound in the earth. It was roughly an acre in size, shaped slightly irregular to follow the natural contour of the hollow, with a shallow end on the upper side and a deeper cut on the lower, where the clay was densest and would hold water best. He had left a stand of willows on the north bank untouched. He had graded a low earthen spillway on the eastern edge so that any overflow would sheet off slowly into the adjacent field rather than cutting a channel. Then he waited. He waited through April, which gave them 2 good rains. He waited through May, which was wetter than average. He drove down to the hollow every morning and every evening and watched the water come up, slow and dark, rising through the clay floor and seeping in along the low western bank where 3 small seasonal springs had always run quiet and unnoticed beneath the root mats of the willow and birch. By the first week of June, the pond was holding 6 feet of water across most of its length. By the end of June, it was 8 feet in the deep end and had settled into something that looked, for the first time, like it belonged there. Like it had always been there. Frogs had already found it. Red-winged blackbirds worked the reed grass that was beginning to establish along the shallow end. In the mornings there was mist on the surface that burned off slow in the early heat. Clem stood on the bank and looked at it a long time. He did not gloat. He did not call Dale Fugate over to look. He just stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand and thought about his grandfather, and about how the land remembers where it wants to put its water, and about how long it sometimes takes before anyone else is willing to listen. The summer of 2012 was the worst drought in Kentucky since 1988. It came on fast and stayed. By the middle of July, the county extension office was holding emergency meetings at the fairgrounds. The pastures had gone from green to yellow to a kind of pale brown that farmers called ghost color, meaning the grass was dead all the way to the root and would not come back until fall. The corn in the low fields was firing, the leaves rolling lengthwise into tight tubes, the plants pulling every last molecule of moisture up from roots that were already running out of ground to search. Ponds that had been full in April were showing muddy bottom. Wells that had never given trouble were pulling slow. Dale Fugate's pond, a 2-acre impoundment on the north end of his property that had been built by a contractor in 1997 and had always been reliable, dropped to less than 2 feet by the 1st of August. His cattle had muddied what was left of it down to a brown soup. He was hauling water in a tank truck from town 3 days a week at a cost that made him sick to think about. He drove over to Clem's place on a Wednesday morning, the kind of morning where the heat was already cruel at 8 o'clock and the air smelled of dust and dry hay. He found Clem in the barn working on the baler, and he stood in the door for a moment before he said anything. "How's your pond holding up?" Dale asked. Clem looked up from the baler. He read the situation in Dale's face without any trouble. "Come and look," he said. They drove down to the hollow in Clem's truck, the old Silverado with the cracked dash and the side mirror held on with electrical tape. When they came over the last rise and the pond came into view, Dale went quiet. It was full. Not nearly full, not holding on. Full. The water line was within a foot of where it sat in April, dark and clear in the deeper sections, with the frogs still singing in the shallows and the willows trailing their fingers in the surface along the north bank. Dale stood there a long time. He took off his cap and held it in both hands the way men do when they are trying to find the right words and not finding them. "How?" he said finally. Clem crouched down and picked up a handful of soil from the bank and held it out, letting it fall. "Spring-fed," he said. 3 of them, maybe 4. They've been running through this hollow for as long as this farm has existed. My grandfather knew they were here. I just gave them somewhere to go." Dale looked at the water. He was a proud man and this was hard for him, but he was also a practical man and practicality one. "I've got 60 head that are half out of their minds with thirst," he said. "I'll pay you for whatever you can spare." "You don't need to pay me," Clem said. "Run a line over. Take what you need." What happened next happened the way things happen in small rural communities, which is to say it happened mostly through word of mouth and necessity and without any formal announcement. Within 2 weeks, there was a 2-inch PVC line running from Clem's pond across the fence to Dale Fugate's cattle operation. And 2 days after that, Lewin Harbour, who was 67 years old and had been farming her late husband's 200 acres alone since 2004, came down the road in her old Subaru with a casserole in the back seat and a look on her face that mixed pride with desperation in equal measure. She sat at Clem's kitchen table and drank coffee and did not ask directly for a while, because she was from a generation that found asking difficult. She talked about the weather. She talked about the price of hay. She talked about how her well was dropping and the garden was burning up and her 3 Jersey cows were not giving half what they usually gave because the pasture grass had gone to nothing. Clem let her talk. He refilled her coffee and sat across from her and listened, because he understood that sometimes the asking was the hardest part and a person needed time to get to it in their own way. "I don't have much to offer you," Lewin said finally. "You don't need to offer me anything, Luann." "I have a freezer full of sweet corn from last year," she said. "And I put up 40 quarts of tomatoes." "That sounds fine," Clem said. She blinked hard. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said. "And your daddy too. I want you to know that." "Thank you," Clem said. By mid-August, Clem Poole's pond was serving 3 neighboring operations plus his own. He had a small gas-powered pump set up on the bank and a gravity-fed line running to a trough on the lower end of his own pasture, and the whole arrangement worked with a quiet efficiency that required almost no maintenance because he had built the thing right from the start, accounting for the overflow in the sediment and the way the springs distributed their flow through the different seasons. He was not making money from any of it. That was not the point. The point was the thing his grandfather had taught him without ever quite saying it directly, which was that a farm is not just a business. It is a relationship with a piece of ground and with the people whose lives touch that ground, and if you manage that relationship with patience and intelligence and long memory, it tends to return what you put into it in ways that a balance sheet cannot always capture. But the balance sheet mattered too, and Clem was not naive about that. In the fall of 2012, while his neighbors were counting their losses and filing their disaster paperwork, Clem Poole brought in 340 bales of second-cut hay from his bottom fields, which had held enough moisture from the pond overflow to keep going through July and into August while everyone else's ground was brick. He sold most of it at a price that reflected the scarcity of the season. He did not gouge. He charged what the hay was honestly worth in a drought year, which was more than it would have been worth in a normal year, and he used the money to pay down the note on the farm equipment and put new shingles on the east side of the barn, which had been leaking since spring. He also planted winter wheat that October, turning in a cover of crimson clover first, working it into ground that was soft and responsive from the moisture it had carried all summer. The clover had fixed nitrogen into the soil through the growing season, and the wheat went in on ground that was in better shape than it had been in years. When it came up in November, thick and green across the south field, Clem stood at the field's edge in the cold and felt something that he did not try to name, only let sit in his chest where it belonged. Word continued to travel, as it does in places where people pay attention to each other's land. In March of 2013, a man named Gerald Sizemore came out from the County Agricultural Extension Office and asked if he could look at the pond and ask some questions. Gerald was young, barely 30, with a university degree and the habit of taking notes on his phone, which Clem found faintly amusing. But he was earnest and he listened well, and Clem walked him around the whole hollow for 2 hours, explaining the spring locations, the way he had read the soil profile before he dug, the slope calculations he had done by eye and confirmed with a hand level he had borrowed from a surveyor friend in town. "You did all this yourself?" Gerald asked. "Yep," Clem said. "No engineer?" "No engineer." Gerald was quiet for a moment, looking at the pond, at the healthy bank vegetation, at the way the overflow was spreading out into the adjacent field in a thin, even sheet that deposited silt and moisture without cutting channels. "This is really well done," he said, and there was something in his voice that was more than professional appreciation. There was something close to wonder. "It's just reading the land," Clem said. "It's what my grandfather taught me." Gerald wrote about the pond in the Extension Office's quarterly newsletter. He used it as a case study in a workshop on drought resilience he ran that winter at the fairgrounds. He brought 2 other farmers out to look at it in the spring. One of them, a woman named Patricia Combs who farmed 180 acres of hill ground south of town, went home and spent 3 weeks walking her own property with different eyes, looking for the places where the water wanted to go. She found 2 of them. She called Clem on the phone and asked him what he thought about each location, describing them as best she could, and he listened and asked questions and told her which one he would try first and why. She built her pond the following spring. It held water through the next dry summer better than anything else on her place. She sent Clem a smoked ham at Christmas. He called to thank her and she said, "No, thank you. I looked at that hollow on my place for 20 years and never saw it." "You saw it," Clem said. "You just didn't know what you were looking at yet." The summer of 2016 brought another hard stretch, not as severe as 2012 but long enough that by early August the county was under a drought watch and the hay market was climbing again. By then, 4 farms in the valley had built ponds using principles that Clem had explained, in one way or another, to their owners. 3 of those ponds were holding. The 4th had been built in the wrong location by a contractor who had not listened carefully enough to the land or to Clem's counsel, and it had gone nearly dry by July, which taught its owner a lesson about the difference between digging a hole and understanding water. Clem was 42 that summer. His hair had started going gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there in his 30s. He had taken on a part-time hand, a young man named Travis who was 19 and came from a family that had lost their farm in the 2008 financial crisis and was trying to learn the trade from scratch. Travis was willing and quick and asked good questions, which Clem considered more valuable than almost any other quality in a person working on a farm. One evening in late July, with the heat sitting heavy on the fields and the frogs loud in the pond hollow below the barn, Travis sat on the tailgate of the truck and asked Clem something that nobody had asked him quite that directly before. "Did you know, when you dug it, that it would work like this? That it would be this important someday?" Clem thought about that for a while. A nighthawk cut low over the field in the fading light. Somewhere in the hollow a bullfrog started up and then stopped. "I knew the water was there," Clem said. "I knew the hollow was right. But no, I didn't know it would matter to anybody but me." He paused. "I just knew I needed to do it, and that there was no point waiting for someone else to." Travis nodded slowly. He was looking out at the fields, at the way the evening light laid itself across the hay stubble and the far tree line. "Your neighbors laughed at you," he said. It was not quite a question. "Some of them," Clem said. "Does that still bother you?" Clem considered it honestly, the way he considered most things. "No," he said. "It bothered me some at the time. But the land doesn't care whether people laugh. It just cares whether you're paying attention." He said it simply, the way his grandfather had said things, without drama, just observation. But Travis sat with it for a long time after, in the way that a person sits with something that has settled into a true place inside them. By the fall of 2019, Clem Poole had been approached 3 times by a regional agricultural land trust that was interested in placing a conservation easement on his property. The terms they offered were fair. The money would have cleared his remaining equipment debt and left him with a reserve that most farmers in his position could only imagine. He said no each time, politely, because what the land trust wanted to protect was the farm as it was, and what Clem intended was to keep working it, keep improving it, keep learning from it. A farm that stops changing is not a farm. It is a monument, and he was not ready to be a monument. He did, however, agree to let Gerald Sizemore, now a senior agronomist with the State Extension Service, bring a group of agricultural students out each spring for a walking tour of the property. They came in muddy boots and carried notebooks and asked the same questions every year and some new ones, and Clem walked them along the pond bank and through the fields and explained what he had done and why and what he would do differently if he were starting over, which he always said with a small smile because there was always something he would do differently. He never charged for it. When one of the university administrators suggested that he might consider a formal consultation fee, he thought about it for a day and then said no. The knowledge had come to him from his grandfather, who had received it from the land itself over a long life of attention. It did not feel like his to sell. In the spring of 2022, Dale Fugate retired. He was 77 years old, and his son, who lived in Nashville and worked in insurance, had no interest in the farm. Dale sold the 400 acres to a young couple named Beck and Sarah Aldridge, who were coming up from Georgia with a plan to run a grass-fed cattle operation and a small market garden. They were in their early 30s, serious and capable and honest about what they did not know, which Clem found encouraging. The first thing Beck Aldridge did after closing on the property was walk the fence line with Clem Poole for an entire day, asking him what he knew about the ground. Clem told him everything he knew, which was considerable. He told him about the North Field's drainage problem and the South Field's tendency to crust in dry years. He told him about the old spring that ran under the east pasture and came up near the fence line in wet springs, and he told him what Dale had never gotten around to doing with it, which was giving it somewhere to go. Beck stood looking at that corner of the fence line for a long moment, his hands on his hips, reading the ground the way someone reads it when they are starting to understand what they are seeing. "There's water here," he said. "There always has been," Clem said. It was, as far as he could remember, the most purely satisfying thing he had said in years. Not because he had been proven right, he had stopped needing that a long time ago. But because the young man standing across from him was hearing what the land had been saying all along, and that meant the knowledge would keep moving forward, which was what knowledge is supposed to do. That fall, on the first cold morning of October, Clem Poole walked down to his pond alone in the early light. The willows had gone yellow and were dropping leaves onto the surface of the water, which was full and still in the way that still water is in autumn, carrying the sky in it like a second sky. The frogs were gone to their winter mud. A great blue heron stood motionless at the shallow end the way herons do, like a thought that has not quite decided to move yet. Clem stood at the bank for a long time. He was 48 years old and his knees had started to complain on cold mornings, and he had a list of things that needed doing before the hard freeze came. The tractor needed an oil change and there were fence posts to set on the east line, and he wanted to get one more cutting off the south field if the weather held. He thought about his grandfather in that last summer evening light, pointing at the hollow, saying the land remembers where it wants to put its water. He thought about the summer of 1988 and the farms that had not come back and the ones that had. He thought about Lewin Harbor coming to his kitchen table with her pride and her desperation and her 40 quarts of tomatoes. He thought about Dale Fugate standing at the edge of this very bank with his cap in his hands and no words ready. He thought about Travis, who had gone on to lease a small farm of his own 2 counties west and was, by all reports, paying very close attention to his land. The heron lifted from the shallows without any warning, the way herons always do, on those enormous silent wings, rising out over the yellow willows in the pale autumn fields and climbing until it was just a shape against the gray morning sky, heading somewhere with the unhurried certainty of something that knows exactly where the water is. Clem watched it go. Then he turned and walked back up the hill toward the barn, where the morning's work was waiting, and the ground was soft beneath his boots, and the pond behind him held its water the way it had always held it, the way his grandfather had always known it would, quiet and full and entirely unconcerned with what anyone had thought it would become.